The funeral for Orson Vane unfolded beneath a white West Texas sky so fierce it made every black suit seem borrowed from some darker world. From the chapel yard, Sabine could see the broken ridgeline of the Davis Mountains, the long road sliding past Marfa, and the distant direction of Red Divide, the ranch that had shaped all of them whether they admitted it or not. Dust skated low across the ground like smoke that had forgotten how to rise. Men who had feared her father in boardrooms, courthouses, and oil fields stood by the mesquite fence and lowered their voices now, as though death had washed him into sainthood. Sabine knew better than anyone how false that was. Orson Vane had been brilliant, disciplined, merciless, and almost impossible to love without paying for it somewhere. She remained through the service with her hands locked in front of her, feeling every glance turned toward her because she was the eldest, because she had been the one who stayed closest, and because everyone there assumed she understood what came next. Thayer arrived late in a faded jacket dusted with road grit and old anger. Calla came in from Santa Fe with a camera case on one shoulder, looking like someone stepping back into a fire she had once escaped with her skin barely intact. Sabine did not hug either of them. She would not have known how to begin. When the casket sank into the dry red earth, wind swept grit against her bare ankles, and for one hard second she was 12 again outside another church, hearing strangers carry her mother's name like fragile glass. She shoved the memory down before it could fully open. After the final condolence, after the last hand squeezed hers too long, Mireya Solis, the family attorney, asked the three siblings to follow her to the library at Red Divide. Sabine felt the house before she saw it. Its cool stone corridors, its dark beams, the silence shaped by money and restraint. By the time they stepped inside, the sun had fallen low enough to pour gold through the western windows and stage the room like a scene already rehearsed. Dead father, living heirs, attorney at the desk, dust suspended in the air like ash waiting to settle. Mireya did not waste time with comfort. She set Orson's will on the leather blotter, opened it with careful hands, and read in a level voice that seemed to draw the walls inward with every sentence. Sabine heard the expected gifts first: the Houston townhouse, the Austin office building, the controlling interest in Vane Resource Group, Red Divide itself, the foundation, the accounts, the investments. Then the room changed. None of it would pass to them immediately. To inherit, Sabine, Thayer, and Calla had to live together at Red Divide for 1 full year. They had to remain on the property as primary residents. They had to jointly oversee ranch operations and attend the quarterly company meetings. They could not sell, divide, encumber, or leverage any estate asset during that year unless all three agreed. If one of them walked away or refused, most of Orson's estate would be liquidated and routed into charitable trusts beyond their control. The silence afterward had the stunned, metallic force of a gunshot echo. Thayer gave a short laugh with no humor in it. Calla leaned back in her chair as if the wood itself had turned against her. Sabine kept her face still because stillness was the first armor she had ever mastered, but a pulse began to strike behind her eyes. She knew exactly why Orson had done it. He had never trusted love to keep his children near him, so he had written a contract to do the work instead. Mireya placed 3 sealed envelopes on the desk and said Orson had ordered that they remain closed for 30 days. Then she added one last detail, her tone almost gentle, though there was nothing gentle in the words. Red Divide was not just sentimental land. The ranch sat at the center of a wider trust structure, and its stability mattered. Sabine felt Thayer's attention shift sharply toward her. He knew enough about the company to hear the warning under Mireya's language. Sabine looked at the envelopes and thought of the papers hidden in her Houston briefcase upstairs, the papers she had kept from everyone, the papers that could rip the inheritance apart before their forced year had even truly begun. That first night, Red Divide sounded like an old ship under pressure. Wind moved through the live oaks around the courtyard. Boards settled in the walls. Pipes clicked faintly behind stone. Sabine took the front bedroom Orson had always kept ready for important guests. A room smelling of cedar, pressed linen, starch, and old absinthe. She set her suitcase beside the wardrobe and stood at the window, watching the ranch lights stretch across the dark like fixed stars. Somewhere below, Thayer slammed a door hard enough to rattle the frame. Calla passed more quietly through the hall, but Sabine could feel her the way some people feel weather before the barometer drops. When they were children, Calla had followed Sabine through every corridor in that house, asking the questions no one else answered. Now she moved past Sabine's room without hesitation, carrying the distance she had taught herself in order to survive them all. Sabine sat on the edge of the bed and opened her laptop, not to work but because the clean blue light steadied her breathing. In her inbox waited 3 flagged messages from First Lone Star Bank and one from the man she had most hoped not to hear from again, Lucian Creed. The subject line on his email was stripped to its bone. *** clock is running. *** Sabine stared until the words blurred. Then she shut the screen. She could still hear Lucian's voice from 6 months earlier, low and amused across a conference table in Houston, while Orson lay half-sedated in a private hospital suite. *** You do not have enough liquid cash, Ms. Vane. You have land, a reputation, and time. Unfortunately, time is the first thing rich men run out of. *** She had signed because there had been no clean path left. She had told herself she was buying breathing room for all of them. Only now did she understand what she had really bought. A year trapped in a house full of history with the one secret that could cost all 3 siblings everything. Outside her window, the ranch lights went dark one by one. Sabine remained awake well past midnight, listening to the old house hold them all inside it. Thayer woke before dawn because ranch country trained the body that way even after years of leaving. He stepped out of the bunkhouse behind the main house, where he had chosen to sleep instead of taking a room beneath Orson's roof, and watched pale blue light ease over the fenced pastures. At that hour Red Divide looked honest. No chandeliers, no polished walnut, no photographs of senators and governors smiling beside his father. Only stock tanks, fences, windmills, corrals, and the low dark roofs of the barns cut against a hardening sky. He preferred it stripped down like that. 2 horses moved along the far paddock in the cool, their bodies dark and silent. For 1 minute he could almost forget why he was there. Then he remembered the claws, the library, the way Sabine's face had not moved at all while Mireia read the will, and the old anger came back fast and clean. Orson had always known where to put the knife. When Thayer was 16 and broke his collarbone in a rodeo fall, Orson sent him to a Wyoming boarding school until his head straightened out. By the time he came home, Sabine had already been half-shaped into their father's image. Efficient, useful, impossible to touch. Calla still believed, back then, that families could one day talk like ordinary people. Thayer had stopped believing that before either of them. He walked to the horse barn, checked the feed room, and talked with Efren, the foreman, who told him a well pump had failed, 2 cattle leases were due for renewal, and the western fence line needed work before storm season. Labor calmed him because it asked direct questions and demanded direct answers. Families never did. From the rise above the corrals, he could see smoke lifting from the kitchen chimney. Sabine would be at the table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee she never finished. Calla would arrive late and wary, as if every doorway in the house required a decision. Thayer kicked a stone into the dirt and told himself he could last a year. Then he did the math in his head, 11 months, for weeks and 6 days after this morning, and nearly laughed. Breakfast lasted 19 minutes before it turned ugly. Josefina had laid out eggs, tortillas, sliced melon, and a heavy pot of black coffee, but food had never once saved a Vane family conversation. Thayer asked what the clause meant in practical terms. Mireia, who had stayed overnight in a guest room to begin untangling estate matters, explained that they would have to document residence, jointly direct ranch and business decisions, and keep Red Divide functioning as a real entity rather than a sentimental shell. Sabine began outlining schedules, reporting structures, and quarterly systems in the same tone she used in Houston boardrooms. By the time she reached the word compliance, heat had climbed the back of Thayer's neck. He asked if she could hear herself. Calla watched over the rim of her mug in that dangerous silence she used when deciding which truth to throw and when. Sabine said structure was the reason any of them still had anything. Thayer said structure was the family religion and it had buried everyone worth mourning. The words hung there, aimed at Orson, at the house, at Sabine, maybe at him too. Calla finally asked why Mireia had described the ranch as the center of the trust, like there was a cliff under it. Sabine answered too quickly that it was normal estate language. Thayer caught the smallest pause before the reply. He had spent enough years around buyers, ranchers, and land brokers to recognize the shape of concealment even when the surface looked polished. Mireya redirected the conversation toward payroll and deferred repairs, but the damage remained in the room. After breakfast, Sabine took a call on the back veranda and lowered her voice the instant she saw him in the hallway. Thayer kept walking, boots loud on the tile. He did not need to hear every word to know she was hiding something. The angle of her shoulders, the clipped calm in her tone, the way she turned her body away from the house. It was the exact posture Orson used whenever he intended to decide for everyone else. By late afternoon, the heat had turned metallic and thunderheads were building over the mountains. Thayer spent 3 hours with Ephraim on the southern pasture repairing broken wire while his mind kept circling back to the breakfast table. Calla had taken one of the ranch jeeps and disappeared into the arroyos with her camera, chasing light the way she always chased distance. Sabine stayed inside most of the day on calls with bankers, board members, or whatever polished people rich families hired to survive the consequences of themselves. Thayer wanted proof before he accused her of anything real. Wanting proof did not stop his imagination from working. When he drove back to the house at sunset, orange dust lifting in the mirror behind him, he saw a courier truck parked under the porte-cochere. The driver handed Sabine a registered envelope just as Thayer came up the front steps. She took it too fast, but not before he caught the logo in the corner. First Lone Star. Sabine said it was routine trust paperwork. Thayer looked at the sealed envelope, then at her face, and understood something cold and immediate. Whatever this was had begun before Orson died. A few hours later the storm broke over Red Divide with enough violence to rattle the windows and kill the lights in the east wing. In the darkened kitchen, candle flames bent in the draft while thunder rolled over the roof like wagons crossing timber. Sabine stood by the sink holding that envelope unopened. Thayer noticed how tightly she gripped it. Not nervous, not unsure, cornered. That difference mattered. He understood then that the year ahead would not be 3 siblings tending old wounds in a dusty mansion. It would be a fight over something none of them had named yet, and Sabine already knew its outline. Calla drove west until the house disappeared behind a fold of land and the horizon opened into a plain of creosote, stone, thorn, and heat haze. The morning after the storm had washed the desert clean. Every branch and spine stood out sharply beneath the sun. She parked near an old windmill on the far edge of the property and walked into the quiet with her camera. This was the only way she knew to think inside that family, to step outside it and turn life into frames. Through the lens, Red Divide became less personal and therefore more survivable. Rust on a gate hinge, rainwater trembling in a trough, a hawk pushing off from a telephone pole, the main house far away like a pale ship stranded on dry ground. She told herself she was only documenting the year, making visual proof in case she later needed evidence that she had made it through. The truth was Messier. The house had started waking old sensations she had spent years numbing out of herself. Her mother's perfume in the linen closets, the stillness after arguments, the sound of Sabine's footsteps telling her whether the night would remain calm or tip into danger. Calla had been 19 when she fled for Santa Fe with a borrowed car and a camera she could barely pay for. Orson had called her work unserious. Sabine had said nothing, which had hurt more. Thayer had hugged her in the driveway and not once asked her to stay. That remained the last clean act of kindness Calla remembered inside the gates of Red Divide. Now she was back because her father had issued one final command from beyond the grave and because some humiliating, unhealed part of her still wanted to know whether the place held anything besides damage. She followed a dry wash toward the western pasture and saw survey stakes driven into the ground at neat intervals, newer than they had any right to be. Near one of the stakes lay a torn strip of fluorescent flagging and the crushed end of a cigarette with a dark gold band around the filter. Lucian Creed smoked those imported cigarettes. Calla knew because she had once photographed a charity dinner in Dallas where he spent the entire evening smiling like a man certain every room would eventually belong to him. She came back to the house through the old side entrance near the darkroom their mother had once used. The room had been closed for years, but Josefina mentioned that the latch had warped and the door now drifted open whenever the weather shifted. Calla stopped in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. Red safety glass, rusted clips, trays, shelves of bottles gone cloudy with age. Dust coated every surface except one strip of counter where someone had brushed it aside not long ago. That made her move farther in. Behind a warped panel near the sink, she found a dented metal tin containing undeveloped film rolls, a small brass key, and a folded note in her mother's hand. The sight of the handwriting made her chest tighten instantly. Nessa Vane wrote with a graceful slant that only looked elegant until you noticed how hard the pen bit into the paper. The note held a single line. If the house starts speaking, do not let it whisper to only one of you. Calla read it twice before its meaning scared her. Their mother had known the family's deepest skill was private suffering. She had hidden something anyway, but she had left instructions against secrecy, as if she had seen the trap before anyone else. Calla slipped the key and note into her pocket, took the tin upstairs to a sitting room with peeling wallpaper near the mantel, and started looking. She did not know where exactly to search, only that people in controlled houses became inventive with hiding places. By late afternoon, she found a loose section of wall paneling and, behind it, a narrow cavity packed with letters tied in faded green ribbon. She called Thayer first because he would come quickly and without speeches. He arrived smelling of sun, dust, and horse sweat, crouched beside her, and together they opened the first envelope. Nessa wrote about loneliness in rooms too grand for truth. She wrote about Orson's moods, about Sabine being handed adult burdens before adulthood, about Thayer being punished for needing gentleness in a family that rewarded hardness, about Calla learning how to disappear while standing in plain view. When Sabine finally appeared in the doorway, the low light behind her turning her almost into a cutout of shadow, Calla raised one letter but did not pass it over immediately. For one hot second she wanted Sabine outside the circle of knowledge the same way Sabine had held herself above them for years. Then she remembered the note. Do not let it whisper to only one of you. She handed Sabine the page. That night almost nothing was eaten. The letters moved through the house like weather, changing the pressure in every room. Calla sat on the back steps after dark, watching heat lightning flicker beyond the black line of the hills, and listened to Thayer pacing somewhere inside. Sabine had taken the letters to her room for an hour and returned with her face paler than Calla had ever seen it. No tears. Sabine's grief almost never arrived in visible ways. But something inside her had clearly split. Calla could feel it. She thought of the brass key in her pocket, the survey stakes in the western pasture, the imported cigarette with Lucian's gold band. None of the pieces met yet, but they leaned toward one another. When Sabine came out to the steps, she remained standing instead of sitting, as if sitting might suggest softness. She should not have written those things and buried them, Sabine said after a while. Calla turned slowly. You mean she should not have told the truth? Sabine looked toward the dark edge of the property where the ranch lights stopped and the land became pure outline. I mean, truth in this family has never stayed clean. It was the most honest thing Calla had heard from her in years, and it sounded less like a warning than a confession. After Sabine went back inside, Calla unfolded the note again beneath the porch light. Their mother had not been sending them toward some old grief already finished. She had been pointing them toward something still alive. Calla closed her fist around the key until the edges bit into her skin, and for the first time since the funeral, the year ahead did not feel merely forced on them. It felt like a story already moving under the surface, one that had begun long before Orson was buried and would not stop just because his will had been read aloud. Houston still lived inside Sabine's body like a second nervous system. Glass towers, silent elevators, conference tables cold enough to sting the skin. Espresso gone bitter in the middle of 12-hour negotiations. Even at Red Divide, with cicadas sawing in the cottonwoods and dust settling on the porch rails, she could feel the city pressing against the back of her mind. On Monday morning, she turned the library into a command room, spreading ranch ledgers beside board packets from Vane Resource Group, trust maps beside payroll summaries, lender emails beside outstanding invoices. The room smelled of leather, wet dust from the storm, and paper gone warm in the sun. She worked because work had always been the only place where fear could be sorted into lists and deadlines. At 10 o'clock, she joined the quarterly company call. Men in dark suits on video screens spoke in careful euphemisms about commodity pricing, regulatory exposure, vendor nerves, and investor questions. Sabine answered each one with controlled precision, giving none of them a reason to guess that the estate was more fragile than the annual report admitted. Halfway through, a private message flashed from Lucian Creed. "You should have called before the bank did." Her stomach went hard. She finished the meeting, shut the laptop, and stared at the reflection of the room in the black screen. Shelves, antlers, her own face drawn tight as wire. She remembered the hospital in Houston 6 months earlier, Orson Gaunt in a private suite, still dictating instructions between morphine doses. He had buried a line of disastrous private investments, midstream ventures, foreign mineral speculation, vanity plays he entered too late because he could not bear being left out of a win. By the time Sabine saw the full numbers, the damage was already moving through the family companies. Credit was tightening. Vendors were whispering. Lucian had arrived with a bridge structure that felt predatory even on paper, but it bought time. Orson signed what he could. Sabine signed what he could no longer manage. She told herself she was protecting all of them. She had not understood that every quiet signature in a closed room could become a fuse waiting for flame. The certified notice from First Lone Star remained unopened on the desk until midday. Sabine already knew what it would contain. Banks did not send thick envelopes to deliver mercy. She broke the seal anyway and read the accelerated review language in one swift, punishing sweep. Covenant concerns, collateral verification, request for additional assurances, mandatory meeting within 10 business days. The ranch, portions of mineral rights, and certain holding shares remained exposed unless remedial measures were taken. Her mouth went dry. She could already hear Thayer if he saw the figures. Not because the scale of the problem alone would shock him, though it would, but because it would confirm the private story he had told himself for years, that Sabine always chose control over trust, command over honesty, their father's methods over everyone else's pain. That story was not entirely wrong. The problem was that another truth lived beside it. When their mother's dependence hollowed out the house and Orson disappeared deeper into work and temper, Sabine became the one who remembered school forms, paid stable fees, covered broken things, soothed staff, and lied to outsiders. She had been 15. No one had called it sacrifice. They had called it maturity. Now that same instinct to carry the load alone had grown into something harsher and more dangerous. She locked the bank notice in the lower desk drawer just as she heard steps in the hall. Calla entered without knocking, camera at her hip, suspicion bright on her face. "Who's been out on the western pasture?" she asked. Sabine said she did not know. Calla set the imported cigarette on the blotter between them like evidence in court. Sabine recognized the gold band immediately and felt her pulse strike against her ribs. Lucian's people had no business surveying anything yet. "Where did you get that?" she asked. Calla narrowed her eyes. "That is not the question that should scare you." After she left, Sabine stood motionless for nearly a minute, the cigarette on the desk, the bank notice hidden in the drawer, the two worlds of her secret nearly touching. Lucian came to the ranch at sunset in a silver truck too polished for the Caliche Road. Sabine saw him through the library window before the dogs began barking. He crossed the courtyard with the relaxed confidence of a man entering property he already considered partly his. On the porch, the sky behind him burned orange and red, and for a moment he looked like a figure cut clean against fire. Sabine intercepted him before Thayer or Calla could. Lucian was in his mid-40s, dressed too elegantly for West Texas, all ease and sharpened eyes. He offered condolences for Orson in a tone so smooth it insulted the dead. Then he lowered his voice and said the bank was losing patience. Sabine replied that the family would manage. He smiled slightly and glanced out toward the fading line of pasture. "The Western Tract is worth more than your father ever admitted," he said. "You should stop thinking like a daughter and start thinking like a realist." Sabine knew better than to answer too quickly. Lucian liked silence because he believed silence belonged to him. Before she could push him off the porch, Thayer stepped through the front door and stopped cold when he saw who stood there. The air changed. Thayer knew Lucian by reputation, if not by every buried page of paperwork behind him. Calla appeared 1 second later, camera still in hand. Sabine felt the whole scene arrange itself like a film shot. Failing light, old enemies, the house behind them, truths waiting just beyond the frame. Lucian tipped his head as if greeting cherished hosts, then said loudly enough for all 3 siblings to hear, "Families rarely survive inheritance with grace." Thayer moved down 1 step, jaw locked, and Sabine had to put a hand against his arm before the moment turned physical. Lucian's eyes flicked to her hand and back to her face. He knew exactly what line he was walking. When he finally left, his taillights slid down the drive and vanished into the dark, but the threat remained like smoke after a burn. Thayer looked at Sabine and asked the question she had been fearing since the funeral. "What does he know that we don't?" Sabine opened her mouth, found no lie strong enough to hold, and said only, "More than he should." The county fair in Alpine arrived with the same rough magic it always had. Gravel lots crowded with trucks, livestock pens clanging at dawn, children in pressed denim guiding nervous animals under strings of lights, country music leaking from ride speakers at the far end of the grounds. Thayer had not wanted to go. The Vane family had avoided the fair for years after Orson decided public appearances without strategic value were beneath him. But Ephron had told him plainly that Red Divide needed goodwill, not just ledgers. The ranch had been carried too long by history and fear. It was time the county saw a different face attached to the name. So Thayer drove in with Sabine and Calla just before dusk, the 3 of them rigid in the truck cab like strangers trapped in the same storm shelter. Alpine spread under the mountains in warm evening light, storefront windows flashing gold, old brick buildings softened by dust and distance. At the fairgrounds, dirt swirled under boots and hooves, and the air smelled of roasted corn, hay, diesel, leather, and sugar. Thayer greeted ranchers who remembered him as a teenager and older men who still called him Orson's boy who could ride anything with a bad idea. It surprised him how many shook his hand without mentioning his father first. Sabine endured the event in dark slacks and a silk blouse too fine for stock pens. But people still drifted toward her because competence had its own gravity in a county built on memory and favors. Calla moved through the crowd with her camera, catching what no one else seemed to notice. A child asleep against a steer crate, a widow buying peach pie alone, a rodeo queen fixing a broken rhinestone on her sash. Watching her work gave Thayer a strange pull of pride. Orson had called Calla's eye impractical. Yet through the viewfinder she made the place feel larger and more honest than the stories told about it. As the sun dropped, the sky over Alpine turned bruised violet, and the Ferris wheel lights rose in the distance like a second, cheaper constellation. For the first time in years, Thayer felt useful in a way that was not simply defensive. He spent 1 hour talking lease terms with a neighboring cattleman and another smoothing things over with the feed supplier Red Divide had nearly lost before he renegotiated. People listened because he spoke plainly. No boardroom polish, no threats, no vain theater. He told them the ranch would pay what it owed and do business straight. That mattered more than he had expected. When the county judge approached with a paper cup of coffee and asked whether the Vane family plan to revive the scholarship fund Nessa Vane had once run for local students, Thayer looked across the livestock pavilion toward Sabine. She was listening, shoulders tight, and he caught a flicker in her face he had not seen before. Uncertainty, brief and almost private, as if she had just realized inheritance might mean something bigger than private assets and control. He almost said yes immediately. Instead, he told the judge they were reviewing the foundation. The answer felt careful but not dishonest. Later, by the rodeo chutes, an old trainer who had once patched him up after a fall clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Your daddy knew how to take. Maybe you'll learn how to keep." It was meant kindly, and Thayer accepted it, but the words stayed under his skin. Keep what exactly? Land? A name? The ranch? Family? He turned and found Calla on the other side of the fence, camera raised, framing him through the rails. For 1 second he saw himself the way she might. Boots dusty, face half-lit by arena floodlights, mountains black against the last light, some old damage still visible beneath the man he had become. He lifted a hand in mock protest. She grinned and kept shooting. It was the first easy moment between any of them in longer than he wanted to count, and realizing that left him strangely tired. Back at Red Divide that night, Calla asked whether she could use the barn wall as a screen. Josefina found an old projector in storage, and together they hung a white feed sheet between two posts in the tack room. Thayer assumed she planned to show the fair photographs. Instead, she loaded restored film from the tin she had found in the darkroom. The projector clicked, the image fluttered into focus, and suddenly their mother was there in moving light. Nessa barefoot in the grass, laughing as she chased Calla with a garden hose. 13-year-old Sabine trying not to smile while hanging paper lanterns. 10-year-old Thayer all elbows and reckless joy, riding a fence rail as if it were a bronc. Then, impossibly, Orson stepped into one frame carrying a picnic basket, younger and awkward and not yet fully turned into the man the world would know. The image trembled. Sunlight flared over the lens, and something shifted low in Thayer's chest. Memory had turned their father into a monument, hard, towering, fixed. Here he was human-sized. That felt almost harder to bear. When the reel ended, the barn stayed silent except for the soft whir of the cooling projector and the restless movement of horses in their stalls. Sabine stepped outside first. A minute later Thayer followed and found her standing on the gravel by the water trough. Phone at her ear, voice stripped of its usual steel. "I know the payment date," she was saying. "No, you listen to me. I said I am not selling before I have another option." She saw him and cut the call. The floodlight above the barn threw her shadow long across the ground. Thayer looked at her, at the phone, at the strain in her hand, and felt certainty settle cold inside him. Whatever she had hidden was no longer merely financial. It had reached the point where other people were naming what had to be sold. He did not ask that night. He went back inside and helped Calla roll up the sheet because he knew if he pressed her in that moment, he might drag the full truth out before any of them were ready to survive it. Calla chose midnight because houses told the truth more freely when everyone inside them believed the day was finished. Red Divide had gone still except for the ticking radiators in the West Hall and the low mechanical hum from the walk-in pantry. Moonlight poured through the corridor windows in pale bars, turning the tile silver blue. She moved in socks with the brass key, a flashlight, and the ugly knowledge that she was about to confirm what she could no longer pretend not to suspect. The key from the darkroom did not fit the library desk or the cabinets in Orson's office. It fit a narrow hidden door behind the upstairs linen closet, a door Calla remembered only faintly from childhood. The room beyond was more vault than room. Cool, narrow, packed with archive boxes, title binders, old ledgers, and fireproof cases. Orson had hidden his life in labeled order. Felt painfully like him. Calla found survey folders first, then mineral maps, then a stack of newer files with red tabs and dates from the previous year. The bank logo on the first page made her pulse jump. She sat cross-legged on the floor in the flashlight beam and read until the language stopped being abstract. Bridge loan, cross-collateralized assets, conditional sale options, trigger provisions tied to covenant breach. There, on a witness line, was Sabine's signature. On another page, copied email exchanges with Lucian Creed's office laid out the trap in cleaner language than the contracts dared to use. Lucian's firm had arranged emergency financing during Orson's final illness in exchange for option rights on the Western Tract if the estate failed to stabilize. The Western Tract, the same land where Calla had found survey stakes and imported ash. Her mouth went dry. This was not a minor concealment. This was a loaded gun beneath the family table. She photographed every page with her phone, hands shaking hard enough to blur 2 shots before she forced herself steady. She did not sleep. At dawn she drove east along ranch roads until she reached the rise near the old windmill, where the western pasture spread below like a raw green-brown sheet under first light. Storm runoff glimmered in the arroyos. Survey stakes still cut straight lines through the grass. Calla raised her camera and framed the land the way she would frame a crime scene. Wide shot first, then details, then signs of human intent inside the landscape. A pickup appeared on the county road and stopped by the gate. Through the long lens she recognized Lucian's landman, the same narrow-shouldered figure she had seen trailing wealthy men through a Dallas fundraiser with an empty smile. He got out, studied the pasture, noticed her, and drove on. The proof of active interest made her skin prickle. By mid-morning she was back at the house, where Sabine stood at the kitchen island with cold coffee and 3 color-coded folders spread before her. The ordinariness of the image nearly undid Calla. How could betrayal look so much like administration? She laid printed photos from the vault on the marble one by one. Sabine's expression did not change until the copied email chain appeared. Then something in her eyes gave way. Thayer came in from outside halfway through the silence, saw the papers, and stopped dead. Calla felt the whole room sharpen around them. White kitchen, desert light through tall windows, one sister cornered, one brother about to understand the full shape of his anger. "Tell him," Calla said. Sabine reached for the word, complicated. Thayer cut it off before it could land. Calla could almost hear the family reflex reaching toward them, minimize, deflect, survive in private. She refused it. She read straight from the contract, her voice flat and clear, each legal phrase landing like a strike. When she reached the option rights on the Western Tract, Thayer swore under his breath and looked at Sabine as if he no longer recognized the person in front of him. Sabine did not deny the signatures. That made the truth worse. Thayer asked whether Orson knew the ranch had been placed within Lucian Creed's reach. Sabine said yes and no, which sounded evasive until Calla understood what she meant. Orson knew pieces, but not the whole. He had been too sick, too proud, too certain he would recover and outrun the numbers yet again. Sabine had finished what he started. The words in the kitchen became sharper, hotter, more dangerous. Thayer accused her of doing exactly what their father always did, deciding in secret and calling it protection afterward. Sabine flinched only once, but Calla saw it. Calla's anger had a different blade. For years she had believed the family's distance came from neglect, silence, and wounds left untended. Now she saw strategy inside it too. Sabine had not merely failed to trust them. She had built a whole survival plan on the assumption they did not deserve the choice. That felt like betrayal in its purest form. And still, even in the middle of that anger, Calla could see how worn Sabine was, how long the pressure had been carving grooves into her. Compassion tried to rise. Calla pushed it down. Not yet. Thayer stormed out first, through the mudroom and toward the corrals, the back door striking the stopper hard enough to echo through the house. Sabine remained at the counter with both palms flat on the marble, head lowered, breathing too carefully. Calla gathered the papers because she could not bear to leave them spread in Josephina's immaculate kitchen like butchered things. Before she left, she asked the one question that mattered most to her. "If this had stayed together, were you ever going to tell us?" Sabine lifted her head. There was no legal polish left in her voice now. "I told myself I would." Calla held her gaze long enough to understand that the lie had started strategic and only later become personal. That did not make it smaller. It made it sadder. By the time Sabine asked them to meet in Orson's office, the afternoon light had gone thick and amber, the kind that made every object look half memory already. She stood behind the desk because her legs did not feel reliable, not because she wanted the power of the position. The office still held her father in cruel detail, silver-framed maps, a pen set aligned exactly with the blotter edge, the faint smell of tobacco though he had not smoked inside in years. Thayer entered first, dust still on his boots, expression cut hard enough to wound. Calla came second and shut the door with deliberate quiet. Sabine had spent most of her life preparing arguments, arranging facts into something people could swallow. What she had now was not an argument. It was sequence. She told them about the losses she found in the private holdings the previous year, the pipeline investment Orson entered too late, the foreign play that stalled, the personal guarantees he extended because retreat looked to him like humiliation. She described the hospital meetings, the lenders calling after hours, the vendors whispering, the board beginning to worry. She explained how Lucian Creed's firm stepped in with a financing structure when traditional lending started to close. She admitted she used the durable power of attorney in Orson's final weeks because he drifted in and out and still refused to liquidate anything meaningful. She signed believing she was buying time. A few months, maybe a year. Enough to steady cash flow, sell peripheral assets, Keep the company from publicly wobbling. Keep Red Divide out of the headlines. I thought if I could hold it together long enough, she said, I could unwind it before either of you ever had to know. The room went so still she could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking seconds none of them would ever get back. Thayer asked, very softly, whether she understood that she had gambled with their inheritance, their land, and their trust all at once. Sabine said yes. It was the first answer she had given that week without any shield around it. Thayer's anger changed shape then. Until that moment it had burned bright and visible. Now it cooled into something heavier. He said she had stolen from them the one thing Orson never offered freely, choice. He said their father had always disguised unilateral decisions as duty, and Sabine had done the same in better clothes. Every sentence landed because it lived close enough to the truth that there was no room left for denial. Calla stayed quieter, but her eyes were bright with the kind of furious hurt that ran deep. She asked if Sabine had ever trusted them enough to imagine they could help carry the disaster with her. Sabine wanted to say yes. The honest answer rose first. No, not really. Somewhere between teenage crisis management and adult legal warfare, she had stopped believing that vulnerability inside the family produced anything except collateral damage. She had trained herself to carry, absorb, contain, and fix. Love, as she had learned it inside Red Divide, looked a great deal like silent labor. Saying that aloud would have made her sound noble inside her own confession, and she could not bear that. So she said only, I did not know how to ask. Thayer gave one humorless laugh. You didn't ask because asking means admitting you can't control it. The words hit her like a hand closing around the throat because they named the fear underneath everything. Control had not started as a hunger for power. It began as the only structure available against chaos. But structures harden if no one challenges them. Protection becomes dominance. She saw that now with a painful clarity that brought no relief at all. When Thayer turned away from the desk, Sabine thought for one terrible second he might leave the ranch and let the inheritance clause collapse. If he walked, Lucian would move, the bank would press, the estate would split, and Red Divide might be lost. The future narrowed in her mind the way a camera lens narrows on one irreversible choice. Instead of walking out, Thayer asked one more question. Does Creed know something about the Western Tract we don't? Sabine hesitated. Calla saw it first. There's more. Sabine opened a lower cabinet and took out an old water survey Orson had commissioned years earlier and then buried because it did not fit the mythology he preferred. The report confirmed a deep aquifer beneath the western pasture. Clean, resilient, rare, and potentially more valuable in the long term than any short-lived extraction deal. Lucian had discovered enough to suspect it. He wanted the land not only to punish a weakened rival but because drought had turned water into the true prize in West Texas. Sabine watched comprehension move over her siblings' faces. For the first time since the kitchen confrontation, the disaster had clear edges they could all see. Debt, leverage, valuable land, a patient predator waiting nearby. Thayer read the survey in silence. Calla sat down slowly, the report shaking in her hand. Sabine stepped out from behind the desk because the desk itself now felt like a symbol she no longer had the right to stand behind. I know what I did, she said. I know what it cost. I'm not asking either of you to forgive it. I'm asking for one chance to fix the part that can still be fixed. She expected another accusation. Instead, she got a longer, more dangerous silence, the kind that comes before either collapse or decision. At last Thayer set down the survey and said, Fixing it starts with no more secrets. Ever. Calla nodded once without taking her eyes off the page. Sabine agreed before either of them could reconsider. It was a small promise beside the wreckage already made, but it was the first honest agreement the three of them had entered into in years, and she felt its weight more strongly than any contract she had ever signed. Thayer left Red Divide anyway, but only for 3 days and not to abandon it. He needed enough distance to hear himself think without the house layering its old noise over every thought. He drove north toward Fort Davis and then farther out to a friend's place where the roads narrowed to ranch tracks and the mountains stood closer, all stone and blue shadow. The land there had always steadied him because it did not care who his father had been. He spent the first evening fixing a corral gate with Boone, the second riding fence at sunrise while cold air cut through his lungs and cleaned them out. But the anger did not vanish in open country the way he wanted. It changed shape. Away from the house, Thayer could finally separate the layers. Fury at Sabine, yes, but also fury at Orson for building a family so starved of trust that secrecy still felt more natural than asking for help. Fury at himself for spending years choosing distance because it was easier to blame the system than risk trying to change it. On the third morning, Josefina called. Her voice was calm, but strain hid under it. Calla had found another letter from Nessa in a locked drawer. Sabine had been on calls with a water attorney and a conservation land trust since dawn. Lucian's people were circling again. If Thayer planned to stay gone, he should at least know the house had picked its next storm. He was on the road 20 minutes later. Driving south, the desert opened in long austere frames. The bright shoulder of the highway, a gas station standing alone in dust, mountains cut dark against a white noon sky. He thought about all the years he had defined himself by leaving. Maybe staying was the harder skill. Maybe staying was the honest one. When he pulled back into Red Divide, Calla handed him their mother's new letter on the front porch before he had even fully climbed out of the truck. Nessa's words were not neat blessings sent from the grave. She wrote that cruelty could ruin a family, but so could silence practiced long enough that it became identity. She warned that wealth taught people to confuse private pain with private rights. Then, as if she had seen the Western pasture years before any of them, she mentioned the old water survey and wrote that land was not always most valuable for what men tore from it. Sometimes its deepest worth came from what it held, guarded, and gave back slowly. Thayer read the letter twice, then followed Calla into the kitchen where maps and contracts covered the table. Sabine looked up from a speakerphone call with a land trust attorney in El Paso, her face tired but clear. No evasions now. No polished half-truths. She walked him through the plan in direct language. If they moved fast, they could structure a conservation easement and managed water agreement on the Western Tract, preserving the land while creating enough immediate value to satisfy the bank and cut Lucian off from his option path. It would require unanimous consent, county support, donor confidence, clean title review, and speed before Lucian could challenge it. It was risky, public, complicated. Thayer listened first with the practical side of his mind, access roads, survey confirmation, neighbor reaction, county politics. Then he listened with the other part, the one still bruised and watchful, and realized something he had not expected. Sabine was no longer speaking like a gatekeeper. She was finally speaking like one member of a team that would fail unless all three of them faced the same way. That mattered. It did not erase betrayal, but it made action possible. So he acted. He rode the western boundary with survey crews and county officials, pointing out dry creek crossings, old access roads, and fence lines where the historical maps lied. He met neighboring ranchers at feed stores, pumps, and gas stations and told them in plain terms that Red Divide was not selling out to Creed. He called men who had once worked under Orson and told them bluntly that if they wanted the ranch to stop being a monument and start being a place again, now was the time to stand up where others could see them. The work changed the air inside the house. Calla turned the old darkroom into a temporary studio and began building a photographic exhibit for the Fall Foundation Gala, mixing Nessa's recovered film with her own current images of ranch life. Sabine negotiated with the bank in daylight instead of whispers. Every evening the three of them met at the kitchen table, and every evening Thayer had to remind himself how strange that was. 3 veins in one room, naming the danger instead of pretending it did not exist. Near the end of the week Lucian came back, this time in person at the western gate. He wore mirrored sunglasses and the same civilized smile that made Thayer want to break things. Lucian suggested Red Divide was making sentimental choices in a market that rewarded speed. Thayer stepped between him and the survey crew and told him the gate was private. Lucian said, "You can't fence off debt." Thayer looked beyond him at the wide open pasture, low light sliding across the grass in silver waves, and felt the answer settle in him with unusual certainty. "Maybe not," he said, "but you don't get to tell us what this land is worth." Lucian held the smile one beat longer, then drove away. Watching the truck vanish down the county road, Thayer understood that empowerment did not come as one grand revelation. It came as repetition, showing up, saying no, staying when every old instinct told you to walk. By October, Red Divide had started to look less like a mausoleum and more like a place preparing to be seen honestly. The annual Vane Foundation Gala, dead for years, returned under strings of market lights and rented chandeliers that turned the courtyard gold. Calla spent 2 full days arranging photographs in the long hall. Nessa laughing in tall grass, Thayer at 10 with a missing tooth, Sabine in childhood profile against a stable door, current images of ranch hands mending fence, wind bending through the western pasture, old adobe walls in town, the county fair at dusk. She titled the exhibit What Remains because the phrase sounded both elegant and stubborn, which pleased her. She wanted the work to feel like witness, not nostalgia. As twilight deepened, cars rolled through the main gate in a slow shining line. Judges, donors, county officials, board members, neighboring ranchers, reporters from Midland and El Paso, and the polished investor class that wore philanthropy like a clean jacket over ambition. Calla moved through them with a camera in one hand and an earpiece Josefina insisted made her look important. From behind the lens, the night arranged itself in visual beats. Women in satin stepping over old stone floors, boots under dinner jackets, waiters carrying trays through mesquite-shadowed light, Sabine at the base of the staircase in a steel blue dress that made her look calm from far away, Thayer in black and denim, fully visible and uneasily handsome, the desert dusk beyond the arches fading toward red-black night. Under all the glamour, Calla could feel suspense coiling. They had letters of intent from the county and the land trust. The bank had agreed to suspend acceleration if donor pledges and title filings held. But none of it was real until signatures became public. Lucian would understand that better than anyone. Calla had been waiting for him all evening, and when she finally saw him step into the courtyard flanked by 2 bank representatives and wearing a smile polished to a razor edge, cold moved up her spine in careful stages. He timed it perfectly, not when guests were still arriving, and not after dessert, when narratives would already be fixed. He moved during the middle speech window, when attention naturally drifted toward the stage and rumors traveled fastest. Calla watched from beside her photographs as Lucian spoke first to a bank officer, then to a board member, then drifted toward Sabine with deliberate softness. Even from across the courtyard, Calla could read Sabine's body clearly. Shoulders set, jaw held tight, one hand tightening on the stem of her glass. It was the frame before rupture. Calla moved closer. Lucian's voice stayed low, but not low enough. He mentioned exposure, estate instability, and the unfortunate consequences of emotionally driven asset management. Nearby guests stopped pretending not to listen. The bank men wore neutrality so practiced it looked almost inhuman. Calla felt the old family instinct stir. Contain, smooth, redirect, survive this in private. Then Sabine did the one thing Calla had not fully let herself believe she would do. She stepped onto the low stage beneath the courtyard oak, took the microphone meant for donor thanks, and told the truth. Not the polished version. The truth. She admitted the bridge financing. She admitted her signature. She admitted she had hidden the danger from Thayer and Calla because she believed she could repair it alone, and because somewhere inside herself she still measured love by what she could carry without asking for help. The courtyard went so quiet Calla could hear the fabric banners shifting in the wind. For one suspended second, shame seemed to move towards Sabine like a physical force. Then Thayer climbed the stage and stood beside her. He did not touch her immediately, but the act of presence was stronger than touch. When he finally spoke, his voice carried without polish and without fear. He said the family had inherited secrecy like a disease and they were finished calling it strength. Calla's vision blurred before she could stop it. She wiped at her eyes, angry at herself for crying while holding a camera, then lowered the camera because some moments needed witness more than documentation. What followed happened with the kind of clarity that felt almost cinematic in itself. Calla went up beside them and introduced the Western Pasture Agreement, the Aquifer Stewardship Plan, the Conservation Easement, the Scholarship Revival in Nessa's name, the donor match already pledged if the family remained united. The county judge stepped forward first, followed by the land trust director, followed by 2 major donors who had been waiting to see whether the Vanes would choose spin or honesty. In full view of the crowd, letters of intent were signed on a standing table beneath the oak. The applause began cautiously, then deepened, then rolled stronger as people understood the arc of what they were seeing. Lucian's face did not crack dramatically. It tightened at one corner, which for a man like him amounted to collapse. The bank representatives requested a private room and came out 20 minutes later prepared to suspend acceleration pending final title filings, which Sabine already had in motion. The power in the courtyard shifted so fully Calla could almost feel it physically, as if the weather system above Red Divide had changed. By the time the gala ended, guests were spending more time in front of the photographs than near the champagne tower. They were talking about water, stewardship, transparency, scholarships, the future. Not Orson's legend. Not the price of failure. The future. Much later, when the last headlights had disappeared beyond the gate and the workers were blowing out candles one by one, Calla stood in the hallway before a photograph of her mother and let the silence settle. It was not the old silence. It was the kind that comes after a storm when the land is still damp and the darkness feels earned. For the first time since coming back to Texas, she understood that resolution would not mean erasing what had happened inside this family. It would mean putting enough truth into the light that the next generation, if there ever was one, would not have to tear open walls to find it. Spring came to Red Divide by degrees too small to notice until the pasture had already changed color. Grass rose greener in the shallow draws, bluebonnets appeared near the south gate, and the western wind lost the hard winter edge it had carried for months. By then the final filings were done. The bank note had been restructured on terms no longer shaped by panic, Lucian Creed's option path had been extinguished, and the conservation water agreement had been recorded with the county. One morning Sabine stood on the ridge above the western pasture and looked down at land she had almost lost through fear disguised as competence. Survey stakes had been replaced with permanent boundary posts. A modest land trust sign stood by the access road, understated and final. Beyond it, the pasture moved in long waves under the wind, plain and extraordinary at once. Sabine had spent years believing value proved itself through conversion, extraction, measurable yield. The year at Red Divide had taught her a different arithmetic. Some things gained worth when they were protected. Some relationships became possible only when control loosened. The inheritance clause had almost destroyed them, but it had also forced them into contact long enough for the family's internal script to become visible, and once visible it could no longer rule them the same way. Sabine now worked remotely 2 days a week for Vane Resource Group under an outside restructuring board she had helped install. She was no longer the sole legal authority, and giving up that role felt less like humiliation than oxygen. Thayer ran ranch operations beside Ephraim and had grown into the work without turning into their father inside it. Calla converted the darkroom into an archive and studio, then launched a foundation arts and scholarship program in Nessa's name for students across Presidio and Brewster counties. The house changed too. Doors stayed open longer. Meals happened without strategic timing. Josefina laughed louder. The place had not become perfect. It had become livable, which was the rarer miracle. On the final day of the inheritance term, Mireya Solis arrived with the trust documents in a slim leather folio and a look Sabine had never before seen on the attorney's composed face. Relief. They met in the library where all of it had begun. The same shelves, the same desk, a different light. Morning sun crossed the rug in bright bands, and the room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and old cedar. Mireya confirmed residence records, board attendance, joint approvals, ranch operations, trust compliance. The formality almost made Sabine smile. It seemed absurd that a year of rage, grief, confession, negotiation, and repair could end in signatures and stamped pages. Yet perhaps that was exactly fitting. Orson had always trusted documents more than emotion. In the end, his final document had forced the emotional reckoning none of them could have reached through feeling alone. When Mireya finished, she slid the last page toward the siblings. The estate was now fully theirs under the revised structure. Shared stewardship of Red Divide preserved, liquid assets divided, the foundation jointly governed, company control redistributed with safeguards none of them would ever again agree to live without. Thayer signed first, hands still rough from ranch work. Calla signed second and paused long enough to glance toward the window where the courtyard oak cast moving shadows on stone. Sabine signed last. Her name looked exactly as it always had on paper. Everything behind it felt changed. When Mireia packed away the folio, she said quietly, "Your father thought proximity might force discipline. He underestimated what it might force instead." After she left, the three siblings stayed in the library without speaking for a while. The silence did not press on Sabine the way it once had. It rested. That evening they walked together to the front gate at sunset, a habit that had formed over the last month without anyone ever naming it. The sky above the ranch opened huge and copper-bright, cloud edges burning rose and gold above the black line of the mountains. Calla carried her camera but did not raise it yet. Thayer leaned against the gatepost with his hat in one hand, looking down the road as if measuring every departure and return that stretch of gravel had ever seen. Sabine stood between them and let the wind move loose strands of hair across her face. She had spent most of her life bracing against exposure. Now she found she could remain inside it without flinching. Thayer asked her, not unkindly, whether she had known when she hid the loan that it might break them for good. Sabine answered with the plain honesty the year had taught her again and again. Yes, she had known it might. Then she told them the deeper shame beneath that choice. Part of her had believed they were already broken beyond repair, and it had seemed more efficient to manage damage than to risk hope. Calla looked at her for a long time and then said, "That was the only part you were wrong about. It was not absolution, and Sabine did not need absolution. It was better than that. It was accurate mercy." Calla finally raised the camera and took the photograph in the last stripe of sun. Three siblings at a ranch gate in West Texas, older than their wounds, marked by them, no longer turned away from one another. Afterward they remained there until the light drained off the pasture and the first stars appeared. Once inheritance had looked to Sabine like money, land, shares, control. Now she knew its true form. It was the hard-earned ability to tell the truth before crisis demanded it. It was the refusal to let silence harden into legacy. It was family remade not as myth, duty, or performance, but as chosen work. When they finally turned back toward the house, the windows of Red Divide glowed warmly against the dark, and for the first time in her life, Sabine walked toward them without dread.